And thank you so much for all of you for joining us for worship together this morning. It's a joy to be together, but it's so good for us because when I think about what happens in these gatherings, I think about how we're kicking off our week by refocusing, recentering our attention on what's most important, about how this event, this gathering, the encouragement that happens here, the praise to God, the speaking to one another, the relationship building, all of that, it kind of recalibrates our souls so that we can continue to live into the story that God has invited us to join. But as I was thinking about preparing for the message this week, I kept thinking about how, in my experience, worship means more to me the longer I walk with Jesus. All right, now I don't mean to say that if you're new to the journey of faith that worship is not important to you. That's certainly not the intention. But what I mean to say is that the longer track record you develop with God, the longer time you spend with God and becoming aware of what God is and means to you and what your ability to be able to live up to God's expectations for you and God's grace for you and all of that kind of stuff, the more that happens in your life, the more you tend to appreciate who God is. In fact, I think one of the most significant milestones that can happen in your spiritual journey, all right, and if you're following Jesus, then this is a lifelong journey of following God. But there's some mile markers along the way, you know, there's some kind of like milestones that happen in that journey. And one of the most significant ones that can happen for you is when you find yourself coming to realize that worship doesn't just happen here or in some other church building or just on Sunday morning or just in a crowd of people. I think it's one of the most formative moments in your Christian life when you suddenly find yourself expressing gratitude and appreciation to God on your own, unplanned, spontaneously, when just life circumstance just kind of puts you in a place where you think, wow, God, thank you so much for being who you are. I mean, that's a big moment in your spiritual journey when that happens for the first time. When you notice God's character, God's mercy, God's blessing in your life, and it inspires you to express worship in a moment that you had not scheduled that. And it just happens to you, through you. It comes out of you. And in that moment, you will know that you are connecting to the story of God in a brand new way. And that's what we're talking about as we open up the scripture together today. We have today and one more message in our series that we've called Running with Perseverance. This last 2 months, we've been working our way through the New Testament book of Hebrews, which is not the most familiar book in the New Testament, but it's a really powerful one. And so we're going to be in Hebrews chapter 12 in a minute. If you've got a Bible app on your phone, if you've got a Bible with you, it's helpful to you to follow along with these passages, but particularly this week, because the passage we're going to read in Hebrews chapter 12 is kind of thick. Like it's a little bit, heady. It's not easy reading, but we're going to work our way through it, and get each other through it because there's some really, really powerful things for us to understand. But before we make our way to Hebrews 12, I want to remind you about a season that happened in the Old Testament story of the people of Israel, all right? Maybe you've seen one of the movies that's been produced about the time when the people of Israel were slaves in Egypt. DreamWorks Pictures created a movie about 25, 26 years ago called The Prince of Egypt. Or maybe for the older generations, maybe you would remember one of Cecil B. DeMille's 2 movies that he called The 10 Commandments. Did you realize there was one made in the 20s that was a silent movie, which is just amazing. And then another one made in the 50s that you may remember with Charlton Heston. But there's this story about how the people of Israel had become enslaved in Egypt, and they had been slaves there for 400 years, for multiple generations. But God hears their cry and decides to bring them out of Egypt. And so he sends Moses, his appointed spokesperson, to argue with the king of Egypt and try to convince the king of Egypt to do something that no king would ever willingly do, which is to just give away all of his free labor and tell them that they can go someplace else, right? So in this story, when the king of Egypt initially says, "No way, I'm not doing that," God begins to demonstrate his power and demonstrate his authority and demonstrate to the king of Egypt how serious he is about this by showing some signs, or it's actually, we refer to it commonly as the 10 plagues. Okay, so he sends these calamities on the Egyptians where they get to experience God's power firsthand. For one thing, God turns the Egyptians' water into blood, but the Israelites' water, just a few yards away, is fine. God sends an invasion of frogs, and the frogs are everywhere, and they can't get rid of them. They just keep coming, but the Israelites, just a few yards away, their houses are fine. God sends a series of hailstorms, and it decimates the Egyptians' crops, but the Israelites and all their belongings just a few yards away are fine. God sends a moment where the entire Egyptian area of the land is subjected to utter darkness for 3 days, but just a few yards away, the Israelites can see just fine. And those are just a few of the plagues that God used to convince the king of Egypt to let the Israelites go. But the plagues were doing more than communicating to the king of Egypt. The plagues were also giving the Israelites a front row seat to see what God can do, to see who God is, to see what God is capable of, to see God's authority over everything. And so by the time Egypt's king finally said, "Okay, get these people out of here. I don't want to fight with this God anymore," by the time that happened, the Israelites had already seen a lot. They had seen signs and demonstrations of God's capability. And then over the next few weeks, there was even more of it. God wasn't done, because God led them out into the wilderness, and they crossed over the Red Sea on dry ground because God parted the sea in half. And then when they didn't know where to go, they didn't know which direction to travel, God led them with a vertical pillar of cloud during the day and a pillar of fire at night. And then when they got hungry because there was nothing to eat out there in the desert, God provided flocks of quail that would show up, and then this bread-like substance from the heavens called manna that would just be on the ground in the morning for them to pick up. And they were amazed. I mean, they had no idea how they would have taken care of themselves. And so just in the matter of a few weeks, the Israelites were blessed to see demonstration after demonstration, proof after proof, sign after sign of God's limitless power. But God wasn't done. In fact, the Israelites could have never anticipated or been prepared for what God was going to do next to prove his power to them. So here's what happens. They arrive at this particular mountain that will become known as Mount Sinai. It's a very important spot in Israelite history. And when they get to the base of the mountain, the text tells us in Exodus chapter 19 that the Lord spoke to Moses, the leader, the one who had been his spokesperson. The Lord spoke to Moses and said, "I'm about to come from the heavens to you in a thick cloud, in order that the people that are with you will hear me talking to you, and they will always trust you." God says, "I'm going to come talk to you, but let the people see it so that they'll know that you are the one I'm communicating with, that they can trust what you tell them." And the Lord said to Moses, "Go tell the people to get ready today and tomorrow. Go and make them holy. Go purify themselves. Go tell them to wash their clothes. Tell them to be ready, because on the third day, the Lord is going to come down on Mount Sinai for all of the people to see." And he tells Moses, he says, "Set up a fence, set up a boundary line, and tell the people, don't get any closer to the mountain than this line right here. Be careful not to go up to the mountain or touch any part of it. Anyone who even touches the mountain must be put to death." And so Moses goes down the mountain and gives the people these instructions on how they should prepare and get ready and anticipate hearing God's voice in a couple of days. And verse 16 says, When morning dawned on the third day, and you got to just picture yourself in this scene, okay? Imagine all of the sights and the sounds and the smells and the feelings that you would be experiencing if you were in this scene, okay? When morning dawned on the third day, there was thunder. We've had a lot of that lately. We're familiar with this. There was lightning. There was a thick cloud up at the top of the mountain. And there was a very loud blast of a horn. Now, none of the people were playing a musical instrument here. This is a sound that's coming from the heavens, from the top of the mountain. All of the people in the camp shook with fear. All right, we're talking about a ton of folks. People who are terrified because of the lightning, the thunder, the smoke, the shaking of the ground, all of this. Moses brought the people out from the camp. And don't you know, some of these people were saying, no way, I'm not going out there. Moses says, come out here to this line, but don't cross this line, okay? Come out here because you need to see what's about to happen. Moses brought the people out of the camp to meet God, and they took their place at the foot of the mountain, and Mount Sinai was all in smoke because the Lord had come down on it with lightning, and the smoke went up like the smoke of a hot furnace while the whole mountain was shaking violently. I mean, imagine what this felt like. It said the blasts of the horn grew louder and louder, and Moses would speak, and God would answer Moses with what sounded to the people like thunder. And the Lord called Moses to come up to the top of the mountain. One person out of all the people called to ascend the mountain, Mount Sinai, and Moses went up, and the Lord said to him, go down and tell the people, go back down, climb back. I just got up this mountain, go back down the mountain and tell the people not to break through to try to see the Lord, or many of them will fall dead. Even the priests who come near to the Lord must keep themselves holy, or the Lord will break loose against them. And over the next few verses, God continues to give Moses instruction. In fact, this is the very first time God reveals the 10 Commandments, these rules that are going to be the way that the people obey God's instruction. But all the people could hear down on the desert floor was the sound of the thunder and the lightning and the horn blast. At the mountaintop, Moses is having a conversation with God, getting the 10 Commandments, but down on the desert floor, the people of Israel are getting the sense that God is not to be trifled with. That this is not a God that you take lightly. This is not a God that you just treat with kind of, disregard, or you don't approach God willy-nilly. You don't act like this is just an everyday kind of thing. This is a God whose holiness and power and magnitude is supposed to be respected. Like that's what all the people in the desert floor are feeling. In fact, as Moses comes back down the mountain, Exodus chapter 20 says, all of the people witnessed the thunder and the lightning and the sound of the horn and the mountain smoking, and the people shook with fear and stood at a distance. They didn't want to get up to the fence. They were trying to go back someplace, right? Like they're trying to get away. And here's Moses coming back down the mountain, and Moses, they tell Moses, they send maybe a spokesperson to go tell Moses. They said, hey Moses, we've seen all that's been happening on the mountain up there. It's terrifying. So how about you speak to us and we'll listen, but please don't let God speak to us. Don't let God talk to us because we're not ready for that. We'll die if God talks to us. And they're becoming aware of the distance between themselves and God. They're becoming aware of the holiness of God and the unholiness of themselves. And Moses says to the people, you don't have to be afraid because God has given you this demonstration. God has come to test you and to make sure that you're always in awe of God so that you don't sin. And the question I want to ask you this morning is, have you ever found yourself feeling in awe of God? Have you ever had a moment in your life where a sense of like gratitude or appreciation or wonder or trying to consider how big everything is and how small you are? Have you ever had a moment in your life when it felt like you had to say thank you to something, to somebody? You know, we talk about this, we sing about this in our worship services sometime. We sing about God's amazing love, God's amazing grace, God's amazing blessing, God's amazing creation. We sing about that kind of stuff, but in your own experience, I wonder, have you ever had a moment where awe just came out of you, where you felt it deep in your bones. There was a moment 50 years ago when Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong had gotten back into the command module of Apollo 11 after becoming the first two humans to walk on the moon. And they're making this long journey back. They spent almost an entire day on the surface of the moon. They saw things that nobody else had ever seen or imagined. They had stories to tell that other people were going to have a hard time comprehending, right? And they're processing their own experience and thinking about everything that they've just been through, walking on the moon. And Buzz Aldrin finds a scrap piece of paper in the command module, and he writes down a couple of verses he remembered from Psalm 8. He said, when I consider, or when I look up at your skies and what your fingers made, the moon and the stars that you set firmly in place, what are human beings that you think about them? What are human beings that you pay attention to them? Now, I don't know if he planned that. I don't know if he, had done a search before he left about, Bible verses that have the word moon in them or something like that. But in that moment, as he was reflecting on everything he had just been through, what he felt was a sense of smallness compared to everything else out there. When I consider the stars, when I consider the moon and everything that you made, God, why do you care about little old me? Why do you care about little old us? I mean, he was experiencing the awe of God, thinking about the grandeur of God. He had just experienced something so surreal, so breathtaking, so exhilarating and overwhelming that he felt this deep wave of emotion about God. And I wonder, I know you've never been to the moon, but I wonder if you've ever felt anything like that. I've talked to some parents who would say, I felt that in the delivery room when the baby was born. I've talked to some people who would say, I felt that whenever I saw something in nature, some natural formation, some event that happens in nature that's just unreal to be able to see. When I went to the beach and I saw the waves coming in, or when I saw the Grand Canyon, or when I saw a volcano, some of those experiences that will create a sense of awe in your life. And I wonder where you've had one. Where were you? And what'd you feel? And how did you respond? Because when something like that happens to you, there can be a lot of responses, a lot of emotions that want to come pouring out of you. There might be tears, or there might be thankfulness, or there might be singing, or there might be silence. In Exodus 19 and 20, when the people saw something that was so awesome at the top of Mount Sinai that it made them want to step back, the emotion they were feeling was terror. They were afraid. They were fearful. And Moses had to calm them down and say, God's doing this to help you. God's doing this to impress upon you a memory of his holiness so that you can understand how incredibly wonderful and majestic and powerful he is. But the story didn't end there, because even though the people of Israel were supposed to remember all of those things about God, they forgot. They forgot a lot. Their generation forgot, and the generation after them forgot, and the generation after them forgot, and it kept going in kind of a cycle of they'd get themselves in a really bad spot, and then they'd remember God, and then they'd forget about God, and then they'd remember God. That was the cycle over and over again. And it wasn't until Jesus came. It wasn't until Jesus came in the flesh that somebody was finally able to keep their eyes on God's intention for their life throughout the entirety of their life. It wasn't until Jesus came in the flesh that he fulfilled the law that the Israelites had been unable to keep in their entire history. But Jesus' life and sacrifice did more than just set an example of what faithfulness looks like. What we've been learning in Hebrews for the last 7 weeks is that Jesus' life and sacrifice opened up a door for us. Which brings us to our passage in Hebrews chapter 12 today. And the reason I shared all of that stuff with you about Exodus 19 and the story of Mount Sinai is because that's where the writer of Hebrews is going to start this passage. According to the preacher that's writing Hebrews, Jesus should inspire in us a sense of awe. But it's an awe that's of a different sort than what the Israelites experienced at Sinai. The preacher says in chapter 12, verse 18, you, unlike the Israelites, you have not drawn near to something that can be touched, a burning fire, darkness, shadow, a whirlwind, a blast of a trumpet or a horn, and a sound of words that made the ones who heard it beg that there wouldn't be one more word. Okay, now that's a long sentence, okay, but I want you to understand he's talking about the story from Exodus 19 about Sinai. He's talking about the people who showed up and saw demonstrations of God's power, and it made them go, nuh-uh, I'm out of here. You know, like it scared them. He's saying, you have not had the same experience where your entry into God's presence instills fear in you. You are not having the same kind of encounter with God that makes you scared. I'm going to skip ahead one verse, Carice, up to the verse 22. He's reminding them of Mount Sinai, but he says, your experience is different. Beginning in verse 22, he says, you have drawn near to Mount Zion. Now, that's a different name. It's a different mountain. The mountain that was out in the desert, Mount Sinai, where God appeared in power and smoke and all of the scary sounds and feelings and the shaking that terrified the people of Israel, that was way south of the promised land, out there in the middle of the wilderness. But Mount Zion is the place where Jerusalem is. Mount Zion is where the temple was built. Mount Zion is the representation of the place where God's will and presence are known and where people come to experience connection to God. And the writer of Hebrews says, you have drawn near to Mount Zion. This is one sentence. That's why I put it on one slide so you could see it all in one place, okay? He says, you've drawn near to Mount Zion, the city of the living God, heavenly Jerusalem, to countless angels in a festival gathering. Think about that. Angels who are having a party. And he goes on, or he or she says, you've come to the assembly of God's firstborn children who are registered in heaven. You've come to where God is the judge of all. You've come, and in this place you see the spirits of the righteous who have been made perfect, and you see Jesus, the mediator of the new covenant, and the sprinkled blood that speaks better than Abel's blood. Now, I know that's an extremely long sentence, and there's a lot going on in here, but here's what the author of Hebrews is asking you to imagine. This is something that's happening in the spiritual realm. This is something that is happening to you, not tangibly, not something that you can see right now. He says, when you approach God, you show up and everybody's happy. You show up and there's a party going on. You're showing up to this encounter with God. You're showing up to this experience of connection to the living God, and there's angels who are shouting and dancing and singing, and there's all this excitement that's happening, and there's people there who have gone on before us, who finished their race and are now with God, and they are there, and everybody's excited. And the spirits of those who have been made righteous, he says. He says all of these people are there, and God himself is there. And God is the judge of all. But everybody is like right up with God. All in one place, right here everybody's on the mountain. And he says, and Jesus is there. Jesus, the mediator of this new covenant, which is what the entirety of Hebrews has been about, is to say Jesus is there, and Jesus is the one who has opened the door for you to be able to come in. It's a very different scene. It's a different scene on Mount Sinai than it is on Mount Zion. It's a whole different vibe at Mount Sinai than it is at Mount Zion, because at Mount Sinai everybody was fearful. At Mount Sinai there had to be a boundary that said don't come any closer. At Mount Sinai, if you got too close, you were in big trouble. You weren't going to be able to live to tell the tale. At Mount Sinai, everybody was scared. But at Mount Zion, we're able to just walk in. At Mount Zion, something has changed. At Mount Zion, we're still amazed. We're still in awe. We're still impressed by everything we see, but we're allowed to come in. And the one thing that's changed is the intervention of Jesus Christ. The difference is Jesus. And when the writer of Hebrews writes this passage, you got to understand he or she is not trying to say that God has changed. Not trying to say that there was a scary holy God back at Mount Sinai and now there's a soft, friendly God at Mount Zion. The author is trying to say God's always been holy. God continues to be holy. God will always be holy. The holiness of God hasn't changed at all, but our access to God has been changed forever. And it's happened because Jesus has opened the way, opened a new path for us, opened up the curtain so that now, because we are covered by Jesus' blood, because we have been redeemed by Jesus' sacrifice, we can walk right into God's presence. And it's only when we remind ourselves of God's holiness that we begin to appreciate just how much Jesus has done for us. Because remember, under the old covenant, the Mount Sinai covenant, there was always this reminder about the distance between humanity and God, about the impassable distance between God and humans. But under the new covenant, God becomes approachable for those of us who submit our lives to Jesus. And so there's one more verse I want to read to you from Hebrews chapter 12. We're going to wrap up here pretty quick. But one more verse, and it becomes the last of 5 different passages in the book of Hebrews that scholars call the warning passages. There's been 5 of these scattered throughout Hebrews where the author says things like, be careful that you don't miss out on what Jesus is doing because it's not going to go well for you if you don't. And these passages sound scary. They sound threatening. They say things like, if you've tasted the goodness of God's grace and then you turn your back on it, there's no hope for you. And those passages sound threatening. But my favorite thing about these passages is that every single time the author tells you about the danger and then says, but that's not how it's going to be with you. You're not that kind of people. You're not the kind of people who are going to shrink back. You're not the kind of people who are going to turn your back on Jesus. You're not the kind of people who are going to say yes and then say no. You're not the kind of people who are going to be wishy-washy. You're the kind of people who are going to finish the race. And so here's verse 25. The author says, see to it that you don't resist the one who is speaking to you. It's not talking about me, it's talking about Jesus. See to it that you don't resist the call of Jesus. See to it that you don't resist the invitation that Jesus is offering to you. Because the people back there at Sinai, when they resisted God, they ended up losing everything. How will we escape if we reject the one who is warning us from heaven? And that is what the message of Hebrews has been telling us all these weeks. It's been saying, listen, Jesus has given you an invitation, an opportunity, a clear path of access to God that's not available anywhere else. And in any other context, the idea of approaching God would be terrifying. But because of Christ, because of Jesus' covering, because of Jesus' gift for you, approaching God is something that's comforting, not terrifying. And so don't miss it. Don't resist the voice. Don't resist the invitation. Say yes to what Jesus is offering to you.